police jail. Oh, Mr. Jonchuck, yes. I hope you had a nice long shelter burst.
Johnson didn't get right, so I didn't line him up.
Okay, we're ready for the jury, please.
Get me ready, bring him in, you got him lined up.
Counsel approach, please. One question I forgot to ask.
So Mr. Jonchuck didn't have any empathy for the pets?
No interest, correct, yes.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that is not a relevant question, but I had an answer for you anyway. But you really shouldn't consider that question or the answer. It has nothing to do with anything. Go ahead.
Are you aware of the argument the defendant had with his mother a couple days prior to the murder, in which he made a statement, "I will fuck up your life"?
Yes.
Okay. What do you know about that argument?
It occurred on the early morning hours of January 5th, and I spoke with Mrs. Jonchuck, the defendant's mother, about that. I also reviewed her deposition. She told me that...
We'd object to your side.
Overruled.
She told me that the night before, she and Phoebe were playing together. She described it as a very nice, interactive play. And she felt that Mr. Jonchuck was very jealous of their relationship. she told me that right around that time, might have not been that night, but she said that Mr. Jonchuck had said to her, "No, everybody cares about the baby, no one cares about me." So the mother indicated...
Objection. May we approach?
No, what is your objection?
Statement we've never heard before?
I've heard it before, overruled.
Can I go?
Go ahead.
Yeah, that was actually in my report. So there was some conflict building, obviously, at least on Mr. Jonchuck's part, and then at either 2 or 3 in the morning, he came into the bedroom and said that he's taking Phoebe and he's getting out of there, and he said something to the effect, "I don't want my daughter bouncing around like a hot potato." Then he told his mother at that point that he was really going to fuck up her life, which, again, she told me that directly. And he left the home with Phoebe and, I believe, a teenage cousin. I also had a conversation with his mom, Mrs. Jonchuck, about some things that he said to her right in the context of that interaction.
What were those things?
Well, he said something to her to the effect of, "I'm your mother, and I didn't molest you. Your daddy and I can't remember the other person, your uncle or your brother, another family member molested you." I thought that was an important thing for her to share with me.
And why did you consider that?
Well, obviously, Mr. Jonchuck at that moment was incredibly angry. I mean, he told his mother not only was he going to fuck up her life, but I think he called her something to the effect of a piece of shit. Mr. Jonchuck's mother was abused by her mother. So I think bringing that up at that time was probably one of the most painful things that he could do to her when he felt a tremendous...
Objection
Sustained.
Okay. Did you interview the defendant's uncle and his partner?
Yes.
Now, the uncle, is that maternal or paternal?
It's maternal, his mother's brother.
Okay. And their names are?
Brian Morris and Tim Maynard.
Okay. And did you interview them together?
Yes.
Does that make a difference when you're interviewing collateral witnesses together?
It can at some circumstances. Obviously, I didn't think it was a problem in any way in this circumstance.
Did the defendant live with them at some point?
Yes.
More than just on a weekend?
Well, they had him a lot over the weekends during his childhood years, and when he was, I think, 13 or 14, he lived with them for about a year.
Did they describe behavioral issues with him?
Oh, most definitely. Again, his uncle, Brian, said that from...
Objection, relevance, and we'd ask for a cautionary.
Overruled.
Said that his behavioral problems began during the preschool years when he was sent home from preschool or daycare. But they indicated that throughout his childhood, he was destructive in the home, would readily break things, throw things.
Would one of those things be a laptop?
When he was 17, they had bought him
Objection, relevance.
Overruled.
They had bought Mr. Jonchuck a laptop to help him with his GED studies, and when he couldn't use it to play games on it and that sort of thing, he went to the top of the landing. I guess they had a large staircase, and he threw the laptop off the top of the staircase. Yes.
Was there an incident with a jar of jelly?
Yes, they told me about.
Relevance. And request for cautionary.
They told me about that as well, and his mother told me about these things as well. When Mr. Jonchuck was, the age is not exact, 5, 6, 7, in that frame of time, he became upset at his uncle's house, and he took a large, what they described as being a large kind of industrial jar of jelly, and threw it over the landing. They said it made a huge mess. I mean, I can't speak to the exact size, but it wasn't like a little, jar of jelly that you get to make your peanut butter sandwich with.
Why is it something he did at 5, 6, or 7 relevant to you?
Well, we have here from the beginning a pattern of poor emotional control. The fancy word is dysregulation of emotion, tendency when things don't go his way, when he gets frustrated, to act out aggressively. I think that throwing an object off of a landing at age 5 and throwing an object off of a landing at age 16, 17 was particularly of interest to me professionally in evaluating this case.
Can we approach Judge?
Yes. Back to the jury suite. Thank you for your cooperation. It shouldn't be long.
Turns out of the hearing, the court, Your Honor.
Doctor, are you aware of a situation involving polishing of stairs?
Yes.
And tell us about that.
When Mr. Jonchuck was a teenager, and this was told to me by his uncles together, they had a large staircase, winding staircase, and one night he polished the stairs so that they would be slippery, and his Uncle Tim actually came down the stairs, fell, and broke a bone. I can't remember if it was the leg or the arm or a fracture, but there was actually some injury, and they described it as Mr. Jonchuck standing at the bottom of the stairs laughing.
And why did,
Wait, say that last part again.
They described Mr. Jonchuck standing at the bottom of the stairs laughing.
and did they indicate why he had done that?
There was no reason for it. There was no reason.
Why is that probative or relevant to you?
Well, it tells me about a lack of guilt, a lack of remorse, a lack of empathy. I mean, these are the guys who gave him a home, took care of him, did the best they could to provide some sense of family and security. It shows a lack of, it shows a callous and remorseless style.
And does it help to, when you formulate an opinion regarding antisocial personality disorder?
Absolutely.
How so?
Well, those are all traits or characteristics associated with antisocial personality disorder. But again, the issue is, this is about a person I'm evaluating, and I have to understand how they think, how they feel, how they behave, and these are all the reasons I tried to talk to other people to get at this information.
I don't have anything further, Judge.
Cross.
What year did you say this happened?
I don't have a specific year. They told me when he was a teenager. They said that he was 17.
And it was precipitated by what?
They said there was no precipitation.
And you said this is important to you because it shows that Mr. Jonchuck, is lacking in guilt
Yeah, guilt, remorse, yeah, callous.
and lacking in empathy.
Yes,
It shows that Mr. Jonchuck is callous and remorseless. Those are the words you used?
correct.
I have argument, Your Honor.
Yeah.
No further questions.
Well, what's your argument?
That if we look at the standard for relevancy, if we look at 403, prejudice and probative argument, if we look at what experts can testify to about the doctor wanting to talk about this aspect of Mr. Jonchuck's personality, that he is a callous and remorseless person, is still subject to rules of evidence. That it may be relevant to somebody in a mental health setting, as a mental health professional in treating or evaluating or whatever it is that they're looking at this type of these personality traits, is that it may be important to them does not mean that it is legally admissible evidence. They're two different things. And we have to remember that Mr. Jonchuck is entitled to have a constitutionally sound and fair trial. He is entitled to due process. And by backdooring in all of this bad act, bad character evidence, it is preventing him from having that constitutionally sound trial that he is entitled to.
Well, I think under the statute, the testimony of experts, they can testify about the facts underlying their opinion.
So then the last sentence of that says it's basically a 403 analysis. Mr. Ellis.
Judge, antisocial personality disorder, there's 7 criteria. This would go to several of those. Failure to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behavior, irritability and aggressiveness, probably by physical fights or assaults, reckless disregard for the safety of others, lack of remorse as indicated by indifferent to or rationalizing having hurt, mistreated, or stolen from another. Those are all things that are admissible under that personality disorder, and Dr. Bertson has a right to establish how he reached that conclusion and the facts upon which he reached that conclusion. And that is one of the things that occurs that implies to those different ideas, plus it also inures to some of the issues in the PCLR, which we've already addressed. So I would indicate, Judge, that this is something that this expert relied upon, that is, and therefore, under the analysis, it does have probative value. It has extreme probative value in showing the witness's diagnosis and the support for that diagnosis. This is rebuttal. We're entitled to establish the diagnosis that he's saying at the time, and we have to establish the basis on which that is done. And part of that is to look into the defendant's background, and some of that requires getting into these kind of actions by the defendant, which the defense has got into what he said. We should also be able to get into what he did. And this is one of those things on what he did and what it means to the expert, Dr. Burstyn, and we ask that you allow that evidence to come in.
Okay, I'm going to allow it. I appreciate you approaching the bench on it. And if the defense wants to specifically object to the next thing, I will certainly consider it. And if there's any more like this, you need to approach the bench. I would suggest that the laundry list not go on ad nauseum.
I understand, Judge.
Okay, let's bring the jury in.
There's 10.1 things, Manuel was looking at that rule that I cited that I thought would be instructive. Apparently that's no longer good law because that was because it was a Daubert rule, and so they said now that we're back to Fry, that's out. But I think we're still back to 403, which Your Honor is doing and has been done, and the case law which says experts can rely on inadmissible evidence in the forms of their opinions. I don't think that matters, but I just want to let you know we
Well,
just
that's
saw
nice.
that.
Thank you very much. No, I don't think it matters. Let's bring it back into this. And again, I repeat, this Manuel, if he gets convicted and I am wrong, he's going to get a new trial.
Dr. Burstyn, hold on just a second. During the proffer,
Deputy Rice, stand by and hold.
you got a whole lot of personalization of him as opposed to this
No,
is
stand
what
by.
kind of act this is. So the less personalization, I mean, this is a callous act, this is a reckless act, whatever. But I think it's wisest if you stay away, we know what you're talking about.
Okay, when you say, just so I can do what you asked, personalization, can you give me an example of?
Mr. Jonchuck is callous because he lacks the
Okay, I understand.
Okay.
Thank you.
There you go.
Yeah, we're ready.
All right. Please in a jury box and seat, John.
Thank you.
Dr. Burstyn, are you aware of a situation involving the stairs in the uncle's house?
Yes, I am.
And could you tell us about that, please?
Sure. Again, this was related to me by his uncle, Brian Morris, also by his mom. When Mr. Jonchuck was about 17 years of age, after his uncles went to bed, they had a large staircase, I guess kind of a winding staircase, and he polished it with this very slippery substance, polish. The uncles told me that it was, in their opinion, intentional, and Tim Maynard, the next morning, came down the staircase.
Mr. Maynard as a witness to anything, and Dr. Burston, if you could please not use him as the witness, but if you have others.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
So the defendant waxed the stairs?
Yes, it was described to me as to make the staircase slick. And again, this was described by Brian Morris, who I spoke with.
And did one of the uncles fall down the stairs?
Yes, fell down the stairs and actually, according to my notes, broke his rib in his arm.
Was the defendant present for that?
Yes.
What was his reaction?
He laughed when that occurred.
Did you interview Michelle Kerr?
Yes, I did.
And again, she is the mother of Phoebe Jonchuck.
Yes.
When did Michelle and the defendant meet?
I can't address the year right off the top of my head, but Mr. Jonchuck was 17.
Was Michelle Kerr older than Mr. Jonchuck?
Yeah, she was 23 at the time.
Okay. Did they become a romantic couple?
Yes, they did.
Okay. And at some point, did they live together?
Yes, they lived together for 6 years on and off.
And did they marry?
No.
Well, did she indicate who was considered the breadwinner of the two of them?
She was considered the breadwinner. She had a large Social Security disability allocation that involved herself as well as a couple of the kids. So she was earning over $3,000 a month.
And when they were together, you said it was on and off. How does she describe their relationship, Ms. Kerr and the defendant?
Well, it was a very unstable relationship. She described that.
Okay. Did she describe how the defendant used Phoebe in relationship to her?
Well, this was long after they separated. He used Phoebe, according to Ms. Kerr, as a way to manipulate her. You know, if you don't give me money, you won't see Phoebe, that type of a thing.
Okay. At some point, did Ms. Kerr start dating a man named Guy Kisser?
Yes.
Was the defendant aware of that relationship?
Yes.
And what did Ms. Kerr tell you about that relationship and the defendant's feelings towards that?
Well, Guy Kisser, Mr. Jonchuck, and Michelle Phoebe, they met as a group on 2 occasions, Thanksgiving of 2014, Christmas of 2014. Both interactions were described as going smoothly. However, after the Christmas of 2014 dinner, there had been some back and forth texts between Mr. Jonchuck and Michelle Kerr that were pretty dramatic, and some talk about mutual affection for each other. And actually, Ms. Kerr texted or by Facebook somehow transmitted a picture of herself topless to Mr. Jonchuck. So a lot of drama there. And of course, she was in a relationship with Mr. Kisser. So a lot of conflicts grew out of that, understandably.
And did those conflicts lead the defendant to try to obtain a family law attorney?
Well, I don't think that was the conflict, because we know from Ms. Torres that she first made contact with Mr. Jonchuck in August of 2014. But I think that interaction at Christmas was a real escalation in reference to contacting Ms. Torres. Again, Ms. Torres said that her first phone call from Mr. Jonchuck was on December 31st, New Year's Eve. So Christmas to New Year's, we all know that's about a week. So in the course of the week, the course of that drama, the course of the escalation of conflict in the relationship, that's when he went back and sent the email to Ms. Torres.
And what is the significance of that brewing custody situation over Phoebe?
Well, to the best of our knowledge, that began in August of 2014. Might have begun sooner. I mean, that's best I know from Ms. Torres. But it was something that probably was there the whole time between August 2014 and New Year's Eve, but it started to escalate after the contact, particularly at Christmas, between Mr. Jonchuck and Ms. Kerr. So there started to be more of a, I guess, it was solidifying that there was going to be a custody dispute, and the tensions pertinent to that grew as well.
Did you interview anyone else as a collateral witness?
I interviewed three of his friends, Mr. Jonchuck's friends. One is Noemi Bresahan. I might be pronouncing her last name wrong.
Can you spell that for the court reporter?
It's Bresnahan.
And what did Naomi tell you?
Objection, hearsay.
Overruled.
Well, she told me that she had known Mr. Jonchuck for 4 or 5 years prior to Phoebe's death. And they had not had contact for a while. And she indicated that around December of 2014, he began to text her wanting to have play dates with her and her child or children and Phoebe. And there was no phone contact, it was just texts. And she indicated that at that point he wanted to stay at Noemi's house with Phoebe.
Had he ever been a roommate with Noemi
They
prior
had
to
been
this
previously, yes.
time? Okay. Had Phoebe been a roommate there as well?
I believe so.
Okay, go ahead.
And she indicated that there'd been a lot of problems when he had lived with her previously. She indicated just a lot of mayhem. There was a lot of conflicts. So they lived together previously about a year before this, for several weeks, and she felt that he was using Phoebe as a way to go from house to house, including to her house. You know, we're homeless, my daughter needs a place to stay.
Objection, hearsay, and relevance.
Sustained as to what she thought. Naomi, please disregard the answer to that. Thank you.
Go ahead, Doctor.
She described Mr. Jonchuck as being very manipulative, always wanting something and figuring out a way to get his needs met. Similarly, I asked her about his behavioral patterns, very poor anger management, would take advantage.
Let's move on to some specifics as opposed to someone's opinion,
Okay.
which was hers. If you will disregard all that stuff.
Any other specifics for Naomi, Doctor?
Well, the issue was that he wanted to live with her at that point. There was residential instability, and that's December of 2014.
Did she agree to have him live with her?
No.
Who else did you speak with?
I spoke with two friends of Mr. Jonchuck's, prior friends, Natasha Clare and Chris Jackson.
Counsel approach, please.
Doctor, without giving us what the opinions of these people were, could you, what was the nature of your conversation?
Well, again, I asked those two people, Natasha Clare and Chris Jackson, various questions. And one question that I asked them, as well as everyone else, was questions about Mr. Jonchuck's mental health history, now in terms of what type of symptoms or problems they saw. And everyone uniformly, including his mother, including his uncle, Michelle Kerr, that he never had a history of psychotic symptoms in the past. His treatment was associated with mood dysregulation.
Objection, hearsay.
Sustained.
you aware of what he was being treated for by Dr. Arthur?
Well, I said back in 2011 to 2013, yes.
Okay. And what was that?
I'm sorry?
And what was that?
What was what? I'm sorry.
Treatment by Dr. Arthur.
Well, it was outpatient psychiatric treatment, and as I said earlier in my testimony, the diagnoses were bipolar 2, generalized anxiety, ADHD. My reading of those records is that there were, over that 2.5-year period, was that there was one note pertinent to some bubbling of the skin, which Dr. Arthur referred to as a somatic. Somatic's a medical term, psychologically medical term for like physical. Like if you say the person has a lot of somatic complaints, they have headaches, stomach aches, all of that stuff. So there was one somatic hallucination which Dr. Arthur reported involved Mr. Jonchuck feeling that his skin was bubbling. I think in 3 or 4 notes over that 2.5-year period, there were reports of paranoia. There's no reports of paranoid delusions, hearing voices. Paranoia, like when people talk to me about paranoia, I say, do you hear people talking about you? And that's a big difference when they say yes. It's a big difference than somebody say, just when I'm out in public, I just kind of feel paranoid. I did not interpret Dr. Arthur's notes as reflecting any kind of paranoid psychotic symptomatology. So Dr. Arthur, in my opinion, was primarily treating mood disturbance. There was obviously bouts of significant depression in the records, documentation of significant depression, and periods of agitation, overactivity. But based on Mr. Jonchuck's self-reports, his family self-reports, never any indication of psychotic symptoms until about around Christmas time of 2014.
Based on your review of all the collateral witnesses you spoke to, your review of all the materials that you provided, did you form some diagnostic considerations in this case?
Yes, I did.
What were they?
Well, the first diagnostic consideration was bipolar 1 disorder with mood incongruent psychotic features. I believe ages ago, one of the other doctors gave that same diagnosis back at the beginning of hearing from experts, which my rationale for that diagnosis, if I may, is that Mr. Jonchuck was clearly an ADHD kid, and as he got older, he started to have depression and mood swings, and it's not uncommon for ADHD to kind of transition into bipolar symptoms. Again, no prior history of psychotic symptoms, mood incongruent psychotic features, but clearly from reading the records, talking to Mr. Jonchuck, talking to his mother and father, somewhere in December of 2014, there was an onset of psychotic symptoms. So I felt, I'm looking more at Mr. Jonchuck back at that time because that's the time I'm concerned with, and I felt that the most accurate diagnosis for Mr. Jonchuck as of January 7th, 2015, when Phoebe died, was bipolar disorder 1 with mood incongruent psychotic features. He was having psychotic features, there's no doubt about it. You've heard about them, the knocking of the Bible, thinking that Phoebe was possessed, Phoebe chanting. He reported that he began to hear voices around that time. Definitely psychotic symptoms there. At the time of Mr. Jonchuck's, of Phoebe's death, Mr. Jonchuck would not have qualified for a diagnosis of either schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder bipolar type at that time. The simple reason for that is you cannot be given those diagnoses unless there's indication of those symptoms for at least 6 months. There was no indication of those symptoms. Now, I'm not disagreeing with the state hospital who saw him months later, but there was a very large, what we call decompensation from the time around the offense to after the offense. I think Dr. Otto spoke to that he was never as impaired before than after. Dr. Mackless talked about seeing Mr. Jonchuck in late January of 2015, where he was laying naked in the pod, mumbling to himself, kind of incoherent. There was never any indication of anything like that prior to prior to Phoebe's death, but certainly no psychotic symptoms prior to December of 2014.
Besides bipolar, what else did you find?
Well, I diagnosed Mr. Jonchuck with generalized anxiety disorder. He's always
What is
had.
that?
Well, it's a degree of anxiety that's kind of always there. Someone feels tense and pensive, nervous. They tend to worry. Generalized means it's ongoing. Now, I questioned him in some detail about another anxiety diagnosis, which is panic disorder, and he did not seem to describe that to me. But of course, more recently, I did read some medical records from, I think, November and December of 2014, where he went into the hospital due to some heart problems, and it sounded like, at least at that point, it sounded like panic-related symptoms to me. But he didn't report it. So there might be a panic disorder there, but the information I had, I couldn't give him that diagnosis. The other diagnosis I gave Mr. Jonchuck was other substance use disorder.
What does that mean?
Well, in an earlier edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, it was listed as polysubstance abuse or dependence. Poly means more than two or three. The new version doesn't have polysubstance, so rather than listing cannabis abuse, alcohol abuse, methamphetamine or stimulant abuse, spice abuse, I just kind of put all that other substance use disorder, and I clarified it as polysubstance abuse, and I made clear, because we're required to by the DSM-5 standards, to say in remission in an institutional setting. That means that he's locked up, he's in a state hospital, he's not using.
What other diagnostic considerations did you make?
Well, I diagnosed two personality disorders.
What is a personality disorder?
Well, a personality disorder is a cluster of maladaptive, long-standing traits or characteristics that cause an individual difficulty in daily functioning. Due to personality disorder characteristics, people have difficulties in relationships, they have difficulties in employment, they have mood-related problems, so they have mental health types of symptoms, because personality disorders, as my diagnoses that I just started to give or I'm giving, indicate you can have bipolar 1 disorder or schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder and have personality disorders. They're not exclusive of each other. They co-occur. And there's ways to what we call differentially diagnose how that happens, but it does. Well, there's ways to tell if someone has a personality, like one of the diagnoses that I rendered, which I'm getting one step ahead of us, is borderline personality disorder. And it shares a lot of symptoms with bipolar disorder. But there are ways to tell if someone has one or the other or both. So that's what it means. You can differentially diagnose. So in my case, I believe Mr. Jonchuck has co-occurring personality disorders and clearly has a major mental disorder, which is the bipolar 1, and maybe again getting ahead of myself, but obviously there's no doubt in my mind that there were psychotic features or psychotic symptoms alive during the December and January 2014-15.
How many personality disorders did you diagnose?
I diagnosed 2.
What were they?
Borderline personality disorder and antisocial personality disorder.
John, showing up for the record, defense counsel, a law of the diagnostic criteria for antisocial personality disorder.
Any objection other than previously noted?
As previously noted.
Yes.
Can everyone see that? Doctor, there's 7 listed categories. For a person to be antisocial personality disorder, do they have to have all 7?
No, they don't have to have all 7.
Is there a minimum number they have to have?
That's a good question. I can't tell you specifically off the top of my head, but there is at least 3 or more, yes.
3 or more?
Yes.
Okay. So the first one on the list is failure to conform to social norms with respect to lawful behaviors as indicated by repeatedly performing acts that are grounds for arrest.
Yes,
Did you find that?
yes,
Did you find 2, deceitfulness is indicated by repeated lying, use of aliases, or conning others for personal profit or pleasure?
yes, I did.
Did you find that there was impulsivity or failure to plan ahead?
Yes,
Did you find irritability and aggressiveness as indicated by repeated physical fights or assaults?
yes,
Okay. That was number 4. Number 5, was there reckless disregard for the safety of self or others?
yes,
Number 6, consistent irresponsibility as indicated by repeated failure to sustain consistent work behavior or honor financial obligations.
yes,
And last, 7, lack of remorse as being indifferent to or rationalizing having hurt, mistreated, or stolen from another.
yes,
Okay. And it indicates on the bottom there, D, the occurrence of antisocial behavior is not exclusively during the course of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder.
that's correct.
Explain that for us.
Well, I think the easiest way to say it is there's a lot of people with bipolar disorder who don't have those traits or characteristics. Again, you can have them both. These are traits and characteristics that have been persistent, and because as it says, there should be evidence of conduct disorder. Evidence. It doesn't have to even be a full-blown conduct disorder. There has to be evidence of conduct disorder prior to age 15. If I look at Mr. Jonchuck from his earliest years through the time he was last in the community, clearly there is a pattern that includes all of these criteria. They occurred, he wasn't flagrantly manic or depressed when these things were going on, because these types of things went on, in my opinion, consistently all the time. That's how it was described to me. And again, the easiest way to think about it is that not everybody with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder acts this way. So there's something else going on. One of the ways to make that differential diagnosis, let's just say for bipolar disorder and antisocial personality disorder, is to do a developmental history and to see that there's certain things that happened in the individual's early life, as I tried to describe with that bonding and attachment stuff that I talked about, that can contribute to patterns of behavioral acting out. And when someone at an early age starts exhibiting impulsivity and shifts between anger and depression, and acting it out on the people around them, that's different than having just a bipolar disorder. They share commonality, but there are differences. And it's the pervasiveness.
The second personality disorder you described was borderline personality. And for the record, Judge, I am showing defense counsel of law of this borderline personality disorder. And published to the jury judge. Dr. Person, on this, and there are 9 different subcategories of this diagnostic criteria. Does the defendant have to have all 9 of those?
No, they have to have 5.
5?
Yes.
Okay. Number 1 is frantic efforts to to avoid real or imagined abandonment.
Yes.
Does not include suicidal or self-mutilating behavior covered in criteria number 5.
Yes.
Did you find that for number 1?
Yes.
Okay. A pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships characterized by alienating between extremes of ideation and devaluation. Did you find that?
Yes.
What does extremes of ideation and devaluation mean?
Well, again, people with borderline personality disorder have strong unmet needs for attachment, support. They're very sensitive to rejection and abandonment. And when people meet their needs, they see them in an idealistic way. This person's all good. And when people don't meet their needs, they devalue them. They're all bad. So obviously, relationships are prone to be very unstable, and it all comes back to that early attachment. Borderline personality disorder is seen by mental health professionals as a disorder that begins in those early years. That disorder is bonded to attachment and bonding. I guess that's the best way to say it. When there's a failure in attachment and bonding, and it's not rectified somehow through therapy or some big changes in one's environment, which unfortunately Mr. Jonchuck never got that. I mean, it manifests itself that way in adulthood and adolescence.
Number 3 is identity disturbance, markedly and persistently unstable self-image or sense of self. Did you find that?
Yes.
Why?
Well, Mr. Jonchuck told me, I talked to him about all these things. I did what's called a mental status examination. He told me that he's always had problems with self-identity, self-worth. He clearly had a history of sexual identity issues. Wasn't sure if he was gay or bisexual or straight. He considered himself fully gay until he met Michelle Kerr, and then he professed his love to her after, I don't know, a week or 3 weeks. So he had that kind of problem, and one of the ways that it manifested itself was, as it often does, is in sexual identity issues. So that was there.
Number 4 says impulsivity in at least 2 areas that are potentially self-damaging. And they give some examples: spending, sex, substance abuse, reckless driving, binge eating. And then it says, note, do not include suicidal or self-mutilating behavior covered in criterion 5. Did you find that in number 4?
Yes.
Did you find that he had potentially self-damaging in the area of spending?
Well, he described it. He described himself as spending money very impulsively. His mother said the same thing. Very bad money management, finances. But it's not just like not being, forgetting to pay bills. It was blowing his money on drugs as opposed to things that real necessities.
And reckless driving?
Yes, there's reckless driving.
Number 5, recurrent suicidal behavior, gestures or threats, or self-mutilating behavior. Did you find that?
Well, it depends on on the definition of recurring. But certainly.
What do you mean by that?
Well, is recurring more than once or twice, or is it 10 times? It doesn't really specify. But Mr. Jonchuck has engaged in at least 1 or 2 self-injurious attempts. He told me about them. One was when he got up with the machete and felt suicidal, or said he did, and then he said there was another one that was an intentional overdose, also during the adolescent years. So there's some of that, at least.
Number 6, affective instability due to a marked reactivity of mood. Examples: intense episodic dysphoria, irritability, or anxiety, usually lasting a few hours and only rarely more than a few days. What is episodic dysphoria?
Well, depressed, but not for all too long, not going on for weeks at a time. That basically identifies the real emotional instability that Mr. Jonchuck's displayed throughout his life, where, anger, depression, he's nice one minute, he flies off the handle. He was described as being that way by everyone I spoke with.
So you found number 6.
Yes.
Number 7, chronic feelings of emptiness. What does that mean?
Well, just what it sounds like, and Mr. Jonchuck had talked about that, when I was doing the mental status exam, feeling depressed and often feeling empty. And again, this goes back to, that abandonment, that lack of bonding.
Number 8 is inappropriate, intense anger, or difficulty controlling anger. Examples: frequent displays of temper, constant anger, reoccurring physical fights. Did you find that as well?
Yes.
Why was that?
Well, I talked about his history. Maybe that's enough?
Okay. And number 9, transient stress-related paranoid ideation or severe dissociative symptoms. What is stress-related paranoid ideation?
Well, when things get stressful, someone becomes more paranoid, which again could be paranoid thoughts, not necessarily paranoid psychotic symptoms.
What is severe dissociative symptoms?
Well, dissociative symptoms are when someone, I guess, people think of multiple personality disorder. It's actually called dissociative identity disorder. It's when someone splits off a part of themselves and kind of takes on a different persona, not in an acting dramatic way, but or they just kind of space out from the surroundings for a period of time. They disassociate. There's different types of dissociation, but it would mean that, and it's not uncommon that people with borderline personality organization have dissociative disorders. I don't think that was relevant for Mr. Jonchuck.
Now, it says it has to be transient. What does that mean?
Well, it lasts for a brief period of time.
Did you find that in this particular
Well,
case?
I found the bouts of paranoid ideation, but I don't think dissociative disorder is, in my opinion, relevant.
Did you conduct any testing in this case?
Yes, I did.
What testing did you conduct?
Well, I administered 2 psychological assessment instruments. I don't know if they're actually, I'm fully accurate when I say tests.
What do you mean?
Well, this is kind of a technical term. One of the instruments I administered was an assessment of violence risk.
Protection, Your Honor, may we approach?
Yes. taking a recess to begin, as you are. This, what's called a proffer, which means everybody listens to testimony and then I decide what part's coming in, will probably take a while. There's no point in you sitting back there. So we'll start tomorrow at 9, everybody? Yes, yes?
Yes,
9. 9. Thank you.
All right, folks, just leave your notepads and then we'll have to say that.
Juror 1179, no Facebook. Can you stay off of it for a couple of more days? Thank you.
Make sure you get all your personal belongings, all right?
You promise a couple more days? A couple more days?
Okay, let's see if Mr. Jonchuck's going to leave, and then we can start.
Your Honor,
Yes, sir.
I have a shot that I have to take.
Right.
As part of my medication. So if you don't mind, I would like to excuse myself so I can get that shot before the doctor leaves.
No problem.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. I'll see you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow.
But I recognize that you took
We redacted appropriately, that's the question.
I recognize that that happened.
And Judge, I know we're not talking about this right now, but the PCLR, you wanted the bottom 3 redacted, they have been redacted.
Thank you.
So we don't have to, for tomorrow, this argument to take.
I wouldn't assure you of that. But
Doctor, you said you did a risk assessment?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
he
And-
said a violent risk assessment.
Yes, I did. I didn't ask a question.
I understand, but violent risk assessment is what he said.
Okay.
So that's what he
Did
said.
you say violent risk assessment?
Yes.
Is this the risk assessment that you gave?
That's the form that memorializes it, yes.
Okay. And you, nature, purpose of evaluation, did you write this in?
Yes,
What does that say?
that says retrospective.
Yeah, of course you can.
It says what?
Retrospective.
What is this?
Well, this is a risk assessment instrument. It's the HCR 20, 3rd edition. H is History Clinical Risk -20 because there's 20 items, and it's the 3rd edition. And what it is, in its most simple way, is it's a laundry list of risk factors that have been substantiated in the research, risk factors that are associated with violent behavior. Now, if you look at the bottom of the form, it talks...
here?
Yes, and so if you look there...
Do you need to bring it closer to you so you can read it?
Well, you see where it says in the dark, it doesn't look marked, but it's imminent violence.
Here.
Yes, what I was looking at the time was the factors in Mr. Jonchuck's life, both at the time surrounding the offense and throughout his life history, that are associated with violence. I wasn't interested in predicting his future violence, but basically what I would hope to present to a jury is that as I was going through this case, I found a lot of factors that I needed to look at, organize, and put into place to better understand what was going on for the defendant during the offense time period. On there certainly is major mental illness, but there were other things going on, and in a way to organize those things, because this is a valid and reliable measure, I wasn't looking at predicting his future violence. I was trying to understand what was going on for him at the time that made him eminently violent, because we know that he did commit a violent act, and I wanted to consider the whole picture of what was going on. It's very easy just to say that someone had psychotic symptoms and overlay them onto what happened in this case, but there's a lot of other things that were transpiring that all had to be put into my consideration for me to make a thorough and complete evaluation of this individual and of these circumstances.
Now, these is broken down into 3 different levels. The first one says historical scale, history of problems with, and it has several.
Yes, and most of those things have to do with one's history and, the violence, other antisocial behavior, things that we've been talking about today. Everyone can see them here.
Now, there's an omit, an N, a P, and a Y. What does that mean?
Well, the omit's the omit. And up on the right, in my handwriting, N is no, P is partial, Y is yes. So it's giving me an idea. It's not a score, but an idea. This is how it's used in a clinical setting. It's only scored for the most part in research settings. But in clinical setting, I used it to give myself a laundry list of things that I had to consider in assessing this individual, rather than just saying he was psychotic and just focusing on that. That's one piece of the picture.
And in that category, you said violence, you checked yes. Other antisocial behavior, yes. Relationships, yes. Employment, yes. Substance abuse, yes. Major mental disorder, yes. Personality disorder, yes. Traumatic experiences, yes. Violent attitudes, yes. And then there's treatment or supervision response, and you've got 2.
Well, I'm kind of going both ways, and I guess I won't talk about the fact that he was on probation and complying with it. I mean, he hadn't violated up until that time, but we know that he was doing some things when he was on probation that he shouldn't have been. Also, in terms of treatment, he reported that he was still taking his medication episodically, so at least partial. Mr. Jonchuck quit going to treatment. He didn't pay the doctor. He didn't. If you're going to say he didn't have insurance, truth is, when you have a therapeutic relationship for 2.5 years, you can talk to your doctor about it. So treatment, it's partial. It's partial to yes. I don't really know.
Other considerations you just marked out.
Yes, there's no. Yes.
The second scale is clinical scale, recent problems with.
Well, that was what's kind of going on at the time. That's history, although it's relevant at the time. But what was going on at the time?
So, insight, you checked yes.
Yes, I don't think he had insight. That means a lack of insight.
Or lack of insight. Violent ideation or intent, you checked P, partial?
Partial, yes.
Why?
Well, I interpreted that there was some violent ideation. When he tells his mother, I'm going to fuck up your life, that's violent ideation. When he says to Ms. Torres, this isn't going to matter after tomorrow, at least partial, that can mean a lot of things, but certainly has some implications. And again, when he's focused on the bridge, he was preoccupied with bridges, people being thrown off, jumping off bridges. Well, I think that was part of what was going on in his mind.
Let me ask you, did you say insight yes or no?
Yes means lack of insight.
Oh.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's written that way, lack of insight.
Then it says symptoms of major mental disorder, you checked yes.
Yes.
And it says instability, you checked yes.
Yes, that has to do with general lifestyle instability.
Then treatment or supervision response, and you got 2.
Same thing as
checks.
above, same thing as above, which I wouldn't talk about violation of probation.
Okay. And then again, you knocked out other
Yes,
considerations.
correct.
And the final category is management skill. Future problems with.
Well, we know that one of the ways to reduce violence is to have a risk management plan, and it has to do with being involved in treatment.
What does that have to do with your analysis in this particular case?
Well, at this time, the time around the offense, Mr. Jonchuck was not involved with treatment. I talked to him about it. It's part of my report. He was at best taking his medication episodically, but he didn't have that support system,
So that's what you mean by professional services and plans at the time?
Yes, did not have it, yes.
Living situation, you checked yes. What does that mean?
That means what I've talked about.
Is instability in his living
Instability,
situation?
yes.
Personal support, Same thing we've been talking about?
Yes, I think his relationship, particularly around the time of the offense, with all primary people in his life had degenerated.
And again, it has the treatment of supervision response.
Same
The
thing.
same answer you've always
Yes.
had. And then stress or coping? She
Well,
says yes. What does that mean?
That's what I'll be talking about as we go further. That, I mean, he wasn't coping well with what was going on in his life at all. That was a big part of, in my opinion, of what culminated in the murder of his daughter.
And you use this again, why?
I used it because as I talked to family members, as I got to know this case in general, I thought that there were a lot of variables that contributed to what was going on around the offense time period. And to just say the guy has mental illness or doesn't, or the severity of the mental illness, and make a decision, in my opinion, is short-sighted. It's really no different than just the first prong of the insanity defense. I have to understand everything possible in this guy's environment, how he's thinking, feeling, what makes him tick, and how he ticks.
So the more knowledge, the better?
The more knowledge, the better, to make a decision about what was going on. I was not interested in predicting his violence as much as understanding the variables that contributed to what's been established already, imminent violence, at that time.
I think that's the presentation.
Did you want to ask more?
Can we remain over here?
Yeah.
So I just want to point out a couple things on here. Where is it at? So this characterization down here is called risk management scale. I didn't know if we had the whole title there, but that's what that says, right?
Yes.
And future problems with it, okay. And so then we've got these different categories of future violence, serious physical harm, and imminent violence. And you have John marked as high, correct?
Correct.
And to go through, talk about some of the specifics, in order to look at this instrument, you have to look at violent attitudes,
Yes.
H9,
Yes.
and violence in and of itself.
Well, history of that's historical, but you have to use this a little bit flexibly. It's what's going on currently and in his history. We know that historically the best predictions of anything has to do with past history. So you're looking at these historical items, but clearly at the time of Phoebe's death, I think that employment, relationships, violent attitudes, not being in treatment. I mean, those are all major mental disorder. Those are all relevant considerations at the time as well.
Okay, but violence is a consideration and violent attitudes is a consideration.
Yes.
Violent ideation or intent,
Yes.
and again, more of the supervision response, just as we had up in the first.
Yeah, they're all
block
the
as
same.
well.
Yeah.
And again, coming back to risk management, we have to talk about the treatment or supervision response again, correct?
Yes.
And the fact that this has yeses checked almost all the way down. We have a partial here on violent ideation or intent and some question on the treatment, but it's all over in the yes category, right?
Yes.
You're saying he's got all these things.
Yes.
Okay. And so it's your opinion that the possibility of imminent violence is high.
Was high at the time, and this helps me understand the various reasons that I have to put into my assessment to make a decision, to help me make a decision about what was going on for Mr. Jonchuck during the offense time period. This isn't a test of insanity, and it doesn't mean that in any way he was insane, but it gives me as an evaluator a lot of things to think about, to integrate in, or we talk about rule in, rule out, means that I have to consider this as an option, a variable, or not.
So you said this is not a test for insanity, correct?
No, there isn't one.
Okay, so this does not tell you if John was insane at the time of the offense?
No, but it helps me ultimately as an evaluator because I'm the test for insanity. It helps me understand, well, it just gives me a lot of information pertinent to my final opinion.
Okay, so in you talked, you use this in your clinical practice
When I do a risk, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
for a risk assessment?
If somebody says do a risk assessment of violence, yeah, heck yes.
Okay, and that would be a prospective assessment of risk of violence, correct?
Well, retrospective in that, when you say prospective, you mean risk in the future, right?
So,
Okay, so yes, that would be the primary way I would use it, but if someone asked me to do a suicide risk assessment, I would use it to see if there was possibility for imminent violence, or in a domestic violence assessment, imminent violence. In this case, again, I wasn't trying to predict the future. That's irrelevant to me. Trying to, and not that I could predict anything in the future, but talk about one's relative risk. I wanted to see, again, what was going on with Mr. Jonchuck at around the time of the offense, other than just acknowledging, which I did, that he had psychotic symptoms.
okay, so to go back to my question, when you use this in your clinical practice,
Yes.
it is for the purpose primarily, I think you used the word primarily a few moments
yes.
ago. It is primarily to assess future risk. Is that correct?
Because that's what I'm being asked to do, and that's the referral question. That was not the referral question here.
Right. Right. So that's what this test is primarily for, future risk.
Well, as you see on the bottom, it lists imminent risk. It's hard, it's dark, so it's hard for me. Future risk and serious physical harm. So it could talk about, there's different levels of violence, and one is serious physical harm. So it can give you really those three, those are the three primary purposes right there in gray and black.
So what research is there, articles, whatever there might be, as to the applicability of a test that is designed to predict future violence? What research is there as to its applicability to the insanity defense?
Well, again, the applicability for me, I can't answer that question, okay, what research there is, but what I'm using it for is to understand as broadly as possible what was going on for Mr. Jonchuck and in his environment, past, present, and future, that contributed to what I have to make a decision about. All of these things are related to how Mr. Jonchuck was thinking, feeling, and behaving one way or another. Some may be relevant, more relevant than others, and I have to sort that out. That's all this gives me. It's part of my assessment process. It's not going to tell me whether he was insane or not.
Okay, so I think that the answer to my question was you can't tell me what research supports the use of this assessment in an insanity evaluation.
Well, I can't. That's bottom line. No, I can't.
Okay. Can you tell us how many other people in your field use this HCR20 as part of an insanity evaluation?
I would have no idea.
Okay. Is that something in journals? I mean, how do we know?
Well, you might be able to find it, but again, I was using it as a clinical instrument to help me more readily and more fully understand what was going on in Mr. Jonchuck's mind, in his environment, in his history, past, present, and future.
When you do an evaluation, when you're referred for evaluation for NGRI, I don't mean to say every time, but are they often more serious cases?
Generally, Yes.
Okay. Like, would you say that you've probably done more insanity evaluations on a first-degree murder charge than as opposed to on maybe a misdemeanor trespass charge?
Definitely.
That would be accurate?
That would definitely be accurate.
Okay. And that murder obviously is kind of the most serious we can get, right?
Yes.
Okay. Do you always do the HCR 20?
Every time I evaluate somebody?
Right.
I use it when I think I need to use it.
Okay.
It's just that simple. So is it all the time? No, absolutely not.
And your purpose in evaluating with Mr. Jonchuck, the reason for your referral, was to give your opinion on whether or not he was guilty or, whether he was sane or not sane at the time of the offense, correct?
Correct.
Okay. You were not asked to just go meet with Mr. Jonchuck and find out what makes him tick, right?
Well, this is the difference between maybe lawyer speak and psychologist speak. Absolutely, if I'm going to evaluate someone in a first-degree murder case for insanity, I better know, at least think I know, what makes that person tick. Just to look at the fact that there's mental health symptoms and make a decision about someone's sanity or insanity based on the presence of mental health symptoms is not enough. Well, I wasn't done. I just didn't want to.
Oh.
I just didn't want to talk with your back turned to me, which is fine. I understand you were doing your thing, but I was waiting. What I want to get across is that this was a case for me where I had to work hard not to have confirmatory bias in your client's favor, because I read the records and there was a lot of information about the presence of psychotic symptoms. Okay, just so you understand how I kind of got here. So as I got further into the case and got more information, I found that there, again, as I said earlier today when we talked about the psychopathy checklist, there's two sides to the coin. And so I use this to help me get beyond confirmatory bias, because I got a sense that there were a lot of other things like this stuff on this list that I had to be tuned into and understand. And rather than write them down, what forensic psychologists don't want to do is just pull stuff out of our pocket, I looked at what we know about violence. This is a violent case. It doesn't get any more violent than this. And I had to think about all these things in conjunction with what I read. And certainly major mental illness is on there. Can't be it's as powerful of a risk factor as any of the other ones there. And that helped me focus my evaluation, again, in an objective, and I'm going to underline that word, objective and broad manner. So I used it clinically, and I fully think it was appropriate, very helpful to me.
Can you tell the court what the research is that says that says that this is valid, this HCR 20 can validly be used as a retrospective assessment?
Well, I don't know anything that would prevent that. And again, looking at it from a certain time period, what was present there at that time, and looking at that point, imminent violence, which was what I was interested in. While I can't cite any research clinically, I don't see anything in any way incorrect with that.
So you're not aware of anything that says it's not. Is that what
That
you're
it's
saying?
not, that what?
That it's not a valid indicator to be used retrospectively.
I've never heard that, no.
Okay.
People, for example, people do psychological autopsies. That would be a retrospective assessment. I mean, that people do that. This would apply in that fashion, certainly. I mean, psychologists do often look backwards and try to reconstruct, and that's what everyone did in this case, tried to reconstruct his mental state at the time of the offense. This is just one of those methods I used.
Your Honor, I have argument, but no more questions.
Anything more?
So this was a analytical or clinical tool in your psychologist toolbox?
Yes.
And you used that to help focus your evaluation in this case? Two areas you thought were important?
All areas that I thought were important, which I think in the forensic psychological community are considered to be important, rather than make idiosyncratic decisions on other things that might, or ignore other things. I mean, I don't think you can ignore some of the things that are listed there and just look at, did the guy have mental illness or not? Did it stop him from being, understanding what he was doing, or the wrongfulness? That's the ultimate decision, but you have to do a lot of work along the way to get there, and this was just part of the work I did.
And the area you dealt with was imminent violence at the time of the murder?
Yes, not to predict anything or to say, somebody missed something. It was to say, these are all the things I have to consider. And I have to kind of sort through and put in and organize in some way so that I do a thorough assessment of this circumstance, which includes the defendant.
Okay. Mr. Ellis, I can do one of two things. I'm not inclined to let it in. I can tell you why I'm not. You can respond, or you can tell me why it should come in, and I'll respond. Either way is fine. Sure.
Again, Judge, just because it is a tool that he used to make a determination in this case, it was not to predict future harm, it was not to predict future violence. It's imminent violence was the category within the paperwork that he did. He also said it's retrospective, even went out of his way to put that on the form. And it's, again, it's a tool that he is allowed to use to help make his diagnostic determination. And it is focusing the things that he has talked about, presented to the jury, narrowing them down, and showing how that applies to the ultimate decision. And I think that that is instructive to the jury. It was helpful to the witness in forming his professional opinion. And I believe that if it helps the jury make the determination, it has the probative value necessary to be admitted, and that's what we're asking the court to do.
Okay. I'm not going to admit it for these reasons. To me, it is much the same and somewhat duplicates the antisocial personality disorder, the borderline personality disorder, the PCLR that's going to come in, which is an outlier. It also would suggest to the jury that he's going to be dangerous in the future. It is obvious what that is. There's no way to disguise it except the list that's used for something else most of the time. Nobody could look at that list and think, oh my goodness, he's going to be dangerous in the future, and that's what's going to happen. It really goes too close to a character assassination because he's going to be labeling him as those things. I mean, it's different to say he did this and he's exhibiting this trait as opposed to labeling him, all those things on that list. And I don't want it to become, I understand it's what Dr. Burston bases his opinion on. However, I do not want it to become, and I want to say this the right way, I don't want bad Mr. Jonchuck to be, I don't know how to say it right. I understand what the difference of opinions are, and I just think that it is extremely prejudiced. I don't think it's that appropriate. They've already heard all that stuff, and they're going to hear more of it. That PCLR is devastating. So for Dr. Burston to have to be testified about lists, more than one list, I think it's very prejudicial. And I understand, Dr. Burston, that it's very helpful for you, and I understand that your opinion is it's very appropriate to use, but that doesn't lessen the prejudicial value to the jury, which I think they're going to take away that he is just dangerous, he was dangerous then, he's going to be dangerous in the future, because he has all these horrible characteristics. So I'm not going to allow it.
I understand, Judge.
Because it's too much. It's too many lists.
Well, they put on 3 different experts who went over the same stuff over and over and over
I don't
and over.
disagree with that.
And we should be allowed to bring it up as well.
Well, I don't care what you go over and over and over again. It's the point whether or not you should bring it up. And I just think it's repetitive. It's hearing the same, where they were repetitive, they talked about the same things happening. Every single witness talked about the same factual scenarios, for the most part. We kept hearing it again and again and again. This is a laundry list of bad character flaws. And I understand that they're arguing that the PCLR is that too, and I've ruled that it can come in under certain limited circumstances, but I believe that 2 lists as an assessment tool is too much. Okay? All right.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so the list, cardboard list is out. I don't want to be sitting up here talking about any of that stuff, waiting to get, again, objected to. I'm starting to get a little paranoid here. Every time I open my mouth, there's an objection,
Well, that's...
So what I'm saying is, I don't have to use the word risk factors, but, these are things that I think are important considerations.
Well, that's fine, if you could phrase it in some other way other than to suggest to the jury that he's eminently violent.
Yeah,
I
got it. I can talk about, these are things I considered, that there was...
Considered what? Give me an
But
example.
I considered that there's a history of violent behavior here. I considered a history of unstable relationships.
You've already said that.
Okay, but if it comes out again, I'm just now that this, I don't
Why
want...
would it come out again?
Well, just in the context of talking, I don't want it, something that you're excluding for me to use something along those lines and for, to hit
Well,
the
I don't know
fan.
how it's going to come out again. I suppose it could, depending on the question. But to refer to that list,
No, that's okay.
or any assessment pursuant to that list, or any of those, most of those features, violence, violent attitude, treatment, no treatment, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But the whole idea of he's eminently violent, he was eminently violent before it happened, he was violent when it happened, and the logical conclusion is he's violent.
I understand that.
Okay.
That's not a problem.
All right.
But if an expert's opinion is that really what drove the murder of Phoebe was a lot of the stuff that I'm bringing up, and I
Right.
brought up again. That's my opinion about who this guy is and what brought him to the bridge that night.
I
So,
understand, but the PCLR was an outlaw.
I understand.
That's
I'm
gonna
not-
be, hold on a second, if he gets convicted, that's gonna be a huge, huge issue. I have no idea what will happen to it, it'll give us future guidance. But to double up on that and have another list, I think is real prejudicial. I don't think it's necessary. You could talk and talk and talk about the things that he's done, and this shows, and you've already done this shows this shows that. You've talked about a bunch, and I'm not criticizing you, of pretty horrible things.
Yeah.
And you've drawn your conclusion as to what that means in your final analysis.
Well, we haven't
But
even
this
gotten
isn't
there.
events, this is your opinion. He's violent.
Yeah, but we can, get away from the, we're done, I respect your opinion on that chart. But again, I'm just trying to understand, partially not to create more chaos, okay? If my opinion is that these bad acts, which has been a big issue, really identify to a large extent who this person is, because they reflect aspects of who he is, I'm just trying to understand.
No, I'm trying to understand it too.
Yeah, I mean, if I have an alternative, then he was hearing voices on the bridge, and I think that there were other things that drove him. I don't know why I can't bring
I
those
don't
things
have
up.
any problem.
If they have to do with his anger towards his mother and his inability to modulate anger and
all that's
callousness, lack of remorse, all that kind of stuff. I mean, that's all part of it.
I agree.
That's who, in my opinion, he is. I don't want to character assassin him in any way. That's my assessment as a psychologist of the individual that I evaluated. And I didn't neglect his mental health symptoms. I don't believe that they were fake, just hear this, and at least at the time, and I don't believe that they were not there. So, I mean, I will always try to look at both sides of the coin. The side that was heads for me was a lot of this stuff. I just don't want to cause chaos in here.
You're not causing chaos. We already got it.
I'm supposed to make people feel good. So, no, I'm not supposed to cause
I think
trouble.
you're supposed to feel bad before you feel good, right?
That's good. I'll drink to that.
Okay. I'm not trying to limit what you say. I'm trying to limit these checklists.
I understand.
And you're getting one in. And we all might, if he's convicted, look back on it, and mainly it'll be me, how could she do that?
Yeah.
So, but that's fine. I mean, if that's what happens, that's what happens, and then it'll never happen again. But no checklists.
That's fine.
But if you
my question was more about, I'm trying to.
well, give me an example of something you would say that you think maybe you shouldn't say.
Well, I think that, ultimately what drove him that night was traits and characteristics. I wouldn't say it this way, but the traits.
Say it the way you would say it.
I would say that, he has a lifelong history of anger towards his mother, vindictiveness towards people who take things away from him. He can't manage the anger. He's very impulsive. I think that there's a lot of callousness and lack of remorse and extent here. I mean, I don't know how I say it because I don't rehearse things. They come out as we talk. But those are all things that might be spoken about that make him sound like bad Mr. Jonchuck. I think it was those aspects of who he is, personality, that really drove him that night.
Okay.
So, I mean, that's going to come out somehow.
How does lack
I'm not trying to trash him. I mean,
how does lack of, and just tell me how it's relevant. How is it relevant to his sanity at the time?
well, if one were to believe that he got more or less to the end of his rope, and the best way that he could punish his mother, retaliate against his mother, Michelle, was to take away what was most precious to them by murdering his daughter. I think that's pretty callous and remorseful. Okay, so I mean, I think that, in my opinion, I would never profile him and say he did it because he's a psychopath. That would be so wrong, so incorrect. We'd never even think of it. But I think that these traits and characteristics.
I agree with you.
Okay,
I think
be
they're
able to talk
admissible.
about that.
Anything else?
No, Judge, not with this witness, we just received additional evidence from the defense as we were speaking on a completely different matter. I think we need to address that.
You didn't contribute to that.
Not at all.
Can I go home? Are you done with me?
Yeah, I think that person's finished for today, correct?
He is finished for today, and he has to be back at 9 o'clock.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I use them in cases it's the public defense. Not about you,
Yeah.
not. Okay.
Your Honor, can I raise one quick issue? So in Dr. Barsh's testimony, the defense discovered a packet of new discovery to us.
Okay.
Here's the police reports from Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office related to Guy Kisser, who was Michelle Kerr's boyfriend. Not sure the relevance of those.
Could I see him?
Sure. So I guess my first objection.
You don't have to stay for this.
For potential impeachment.
Huh?
Just for potential impeachment.
Of who, Guy Kisser or Dr. Burston or who?
Depending on what is said, I suppose.
So I'm not sure where they're going with that. My first objection is timeliness. We have a witness on the stand, so I'm asking that that evidence be excluded. It's untimely. Dr. Burson's in the middle of his direct.
Do you want him to stay or can he leave, Dr. Burson?
He can leave.
Okay.
But
Have a meeting.
He may need to see this evidence.
Yes.
You're going to allow it in, so I'd ask him not to leave.
But
You
he
have
can
to
leave
give
the
a copy
courtroom.
of it.
He can stay out in the hallway if he wants to get out of here.
That's fine.
Okay.
I just didn't want him to leave the building.
Okay.
And that was going to be my next request. If Your Honor is not inclined to exclude it, I don't think Ms. Manuel has an objection. Dr. Burson would need to see it.
You don't know how you would use this?
One thing that made me think that it would potentially be relevant, why I felt the need that I needed to list it all of a sudden with Dr. Burston, is because he had made some statement to the effect of John feeling threatened because of Michelle and Guy's stability. So certainly I think those reports would question whether they're in a stable relationship. Dr. Lazaro also in reviewing her stuff this weekend, there's some statements. So obviously I think it would only be potentially admissible as impeachment, but now that Dr. Burston has said something that I could see it would be potentially admissible depending on where that goes.
But isn't it Mr. Jonchuck's perception, not what reality is? What matters, if he perceived it's a stable environment, even though maybe, obviously probably wasn't.
Right, but the way it came out was that it was a stable environment, and so that was a legitimate threat to him.
Oh, I see, okay.
The problem is that that is evidence that they could have anticipated could come up because both in their depositions, both of our experts and their reports, they talk about the fact that the defendant saw Guy Kisser and Michelle Kerr being back together again as a threat. That's already come out, so it's not timely, it's too late. The witness is in the middle of his testimony, now we have to get new information to rely on after we're already almost finished with the direct examination. That's unfair. And it's not like this is new information that they could have just learned about. These are old arrests.
Well, he did call the residence a stable residence. I think he did do that.
Right.
Right. And
I don't think he said Mr. Jonchuck told me it was.
Right, my point was, had they provided that to us prior, then he could have reviewed that and might have testified differently
Did
about
he
it.
say that in his deposition?
But now they're trying to make him look bad.
I don't know. I got these when I was reviewing the CPI reports that the state provided to me. I realized that there were report numbers referenced that they had not been provided to me. I requested them last week. And so I just had reviewed them this weekend, and
This was in that?
those, yeah, they're in the
Okay.
CPI, they're referenced, the report numbers I got from the CPI reports the state discovered over.
She's saying the report numbers are referenced, but not
Right, and
those
so
reports.
I put in a request and just got them the end of last week, reviewed them this weekend, and realized that they may be relevant for impeachment.
Did he say in his report or his deposition that it was a stable residence?
I don't know if he did.
Oh, I think that's kind of important.
Well, I think regardless, it still would be admissible for impeachment purposes.
Well,
Both of our experts have said from the beginning that, and this is in Dr. Lazaro's report, Guy Kisser could drive. The mother of Phoebe, Michelle Kerr, couldn't drive because of her MS. And so when the Guy Kisser comes into the picture and is a boyfriend, that they have a home together, and they're living as a family unit, and now all of a sudden he can drive and there's transportation, they can come get Phoebe anytime they want her, that's a threat. That's in the report of Dr. Lazaro. I'm sure that that's in Dr. Burson's information as well, so that's not new information.
And Dr. Burson testified that when they went to Thanksgiving together, things looked good. And went to Christmas together, things appeared to be well as well. And that's right. And shortly after Christmas is when the defendant starts to gear up the attorney for the family law problem. That's the testimony. So the defendant felt that this was an issue. Again, Judge, we're getting evidence in the middle, or actually the end of the trial, and that's objectionable and improper.
It's timely disclosed. We received it. It
Fine,
is potential
making that today.
impeachment. Technically, it could be questionable whether it needs to be disclosed this soon. We certainly have, in an abundance of caution, because we're hoping everybody follows the rules. And when they elicited the statements from Michelle
I
Kerr,
appreciate the cheap
and
shots.
Could we have 10 minutes of silence and I will read this?
yes, can I make one more point though, just so the
No,
court's
10 minutes of silence and I'm going to sit here and read this. Okay? Thank you. Okay, this one I'm reading is Michelle Jonchuck's complaint. Is that what I'm reading? On Guy Kisser's way, I called him. Way home, I called him because I needed cigarettes. Is that her?
I think so.
Okay, so I'm trying to figure it out. I think it is. Yeah, while Larry grabbed my purse. Okay, so that's her. So that doesn't have, a domestic violence episode between the two of them in May, in my mind, would have nothing to do with this.
Do you want me to respond as to why I think it is relevant or no?
No, I'm just thinking to myself.
Okay.
This is another domestic between him and Michelle. Okay, it would appear to be a home riddled with domestic violence. None of these reports, one happened January 3rd, one happened in early December. The only report that I've read that has anything to do with Mr. Jonchuck, and maybe this one doesn't either. Yeah, none of these are about the defendant. He's not, I don't think his name is mentioned.
Correct, his name
Okay,
isn't
fine.
mentioned, that's not the,
Okay.
right.
All right, so why, I understand Shirley rebuts Dr. Burston saying that it's a stable household. I would agree with you there, but what other purpose?
Here's why they're all relevant, Judge.
Okay.
The situation we're in, and I'm not trying to re-argue with the position, is that Dr. Burston is talking to collateral sources. He's relying on those collateral sources to form his opinion. Therefore, if those opinions are wrong, if that information is wrong, then he's wrongfully relied on it, his opinion is not accurate. If Michelle Kerr was here and said, I got my life together, I got a stable home, I could confront her, but I can't because the state is not using her as their witness. They're using Dr. Burston to tell us, I talked to Michelle Kerr, and based upon what she told me, this is what my opinion is.
Why can't you get her here if you want?
Well, I think that our argument is that is what's wrong with allowing this in, is that our confrontation clause is being violated.
It's what an expert relies on. It's not part of the confrontation clause, but I don't, so explain to me why these come in.
Because he's relying on that she's in a stable environment. She's not.
It's what Mr. Jonchuck thought. It doesn't matter what Dr. Burston thought.
Well, and I understand if you're denying it, if you're denying my argument because of that, I understand. But I don't think it's that simple. I think that it's Dr. Burston relying on the truthfulness of what Michelle Kerr told him.
About the residents?
About the residents and the because it's all tied together, the residents and the relationship to Guy Kisser. And obviously...
Well, let me ask you this, to refresh my recollection. What has Dr. Burston testified about as to what he knew about the relationship with Michelle Kerr? Not much, I don't think, but go ahead.
Well, and the notes I have are probably not as good as other people's, but this is what I have. That he talked to Michelle, and she described that they'd had she, John, and Guy Kisser had 2 meetings, and that they went well, Thanksgiving dinner and the Christmas dinner, and that from what I understand, he said that there was a custody battle, and that Michelle Kerr was going to seek custody, and therefore that was what the threat to John was. I don't think that that's accurate. I don't think that it did go well. I mean, we've heard evidence that John was outside talking to a wall, talking to himself during that. And we've also heard that he said that that Guy and Michelle had it all together, and that things were going well.
How many people have it all together at their Thanksgiving and Christmas dinner, and underneath?
With the opinion that, I mean, if we're not allowed to confront this, then the juror's opinion, then the testimony from Dr. Burston is Michelle and Guy had it all together.
Well,
and we have an arrest on January 3rd.
I don't know if he said that, or he said that John, I don't ever recall him saying that they had it all together.
He did make one more comment also about when he said that the state, and he referenced it at least twice, maybe 3 times, that he said, well, John was making a violent threat when he said to the attorney, none of this is going to matter. We have evidence that he told the priest, none of this is going to matter because I think I'm going to win without my attorney, which is certainly if Burston is saying this is what he meant by that statement, it certainly goes to attack his credibility on, well, you assume that's what he meant, but you're also aware that Michelle Kerr was arrested for a felony 3 days before this happened. So while he's attributing that statement as a violent threat, there was also a very plausible explanation being, I don't need an attorney because she can't stay out of jail. And so he has attributed his opinion to that, and so it is certainly worthy of cross-examination whether he takes into account the circumstances of Michelle's arrest at the time.
I can
So
answer that,
this,
Judge.
hold on, I got one question. So you didn't have this until your experts were done?
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, no, our experts don't have any of it.
Okay. Makes
So-
I mean, I will give it to them obviously now since I've given it to the state, but I don't know what they would testify about it.
The fact that the defendant thought that Michelle Kerr had been arrested right around the time that he saw the lawyer has already come out in front of the jury, because that was his explanation to the Hillsborough County Sheriff's deputy doing the Baker Act as to why he made that statement. It won't matter anymore. And we brought that out. For us, that was evidence that he was not psychotic because he was able to make that rational statement. So, but that evidence of her arrest is already out. So I'd like to address the timeliness of this. When you talk about ambush, that's kind of an ambush when after he's testified about it, they give us the evidence that would attempt to contradict him, just to make him look bad. You said this, you said they were settled, but isn't it true that we have these reports that say this, that you've never seen and didn't have the opportunity to review prior to your testimony? It's completely untimely, it's an ambush of Dr. Burson, and it's unfair. And I would also argue it's not relevant because all that matters is the defendant's perception. We're talking about the defendant, and that's what Dr. Burson was testifying about, the defendant's perceptions. That Guy Kisser and Michelle Kerr were together, the defendant was aware of that, he was aware of the relationship that they had together. He testified that they met as a group on Thanksgiving, Christmas, after dinner. There were text messages between the defendant and Michelle Kerr that were dramatic. There was talk of mutual affection. Michelle Kerr sent the topless photo. There were conflicts that led to the child custody issue. That was the crux of Dr. Burson's testimony. So I'm objecting for timeliness. It's unfair, it's an ambush of him, and it's just to make him look bad, that now they would give that to him, and it's irrelevant.
Well, I understand it only matters what was in John's mind. It doesn't have anything to do with Dr. Burson. However, and I couldn't tell you verbatim the testimony, I certainly got the impression after he testified that not only John thought it was, I guess, an okay place, I don't know, but that he did too, because he kind of described it in rather like home on the prairie kind of thing. He just, I don't know, I'd have to have a read back of his testimony. So then the jury's thinking, oh, you know, this really was a great place. And here he knows he's going to lose his child to this great place. I think that's the impression they may have been left with because of how, that's the impression I was left with that was being conveyed to them, but I don't know if I'm wrong. Maybe he only said John thought Thanksgiving went well, Christmas went well, and that's it. But
Well,
I don't think that's,
Right.
that's my concern.
I understand. I think that if that's the way it came out, and then that's how Your Honor saw it.
Well, we could.
But what I was going to suggest was, I think Dr. Burson is aware that it was not as cozy as that, you know. So I think we could give him, we could address it because he's still testifying on direct.
I don't have a problem with that.
So,
Do you want to have the read back of what he actually said?
yes.
Okay.
What am I reading back about his Christmas,
About-
the Christmas and Thanksgiving?
There's a lot of stuff about Michelle Jonchuck's family in there.
Oh.
About Guy Kisser might be a word, a key word.
Kerr,
Kerr.
Michelle Kerr.
No, Guy Kisser.
Are we
Right,
talking
right. I
about
think he might have-
Thanksgiving, the Thanksgiving
That was-
reference, is that we're talking Christmas and Thanksgiving?
Somewhere around there.
At some point, did Miss Kerr start dating a guy named Guy Kisser? Answer yes. Was the defendant aware of that relationship? Answer yes. Question. What did Miss Kerr tell you about that relationship and the defendant's feelings towards that? Answer, well, Guy Kisser, John Mr. Jonchuck and Michelle Phoebe, they met on as a group on 2 occasions, Thanksgiving of 2014, Christmas 2014. Both interactions were described as going smoothly. However, after the Christmas of 2004 dinner, there had been some back and forth texts between Mr. Jonchuck and Michelle Kerr that they were pretty dramatic. Some talk about mutual affection for each other, and actually Ms. Kerr texted her by Facebook, somehow transmitted a picture of herself topless to Mr. Jonchuck, a lot of drama there. And of course, she was in a relationship with Mr. Kisser, so a lot of conflict grew out of that, understandably. Question, did those conflicts lead the defendant to try to obtain a family law attorney? Do you want me?
Yes, please.
Well, I don't think that was the conflict, because we know from Ms. Torres that she first made contact with Mr. Jonchuck in August of 2014. But I think that that interaction at Christmas was a real escalation in reference to contacting Ms. Torres. Ms. Torres said the first phone call from Mr. Jonchuck was on December 31st, New Year's Eve, so Christmas to New Year's Eve, we know that's about a month. We know that's about a week. So in the course of a week, in the course of that drama, in the course of the escalation of the conflict and the relationship, that's when he went back and sent the email to Ms. Torres. Am I reading now? I don't know what else you want me to read.
And the question is, how's that impeachment?
Go ahead.
I would just ask the question is, how's that impeachment?
Well, I don't think that's impeachment, but I wonder about, after tomorrow, it won't matter. But when was, I mean, that's not next to her arrest for domestic violence, wasn't that?
No, she was arrested January 3rd of 2015.
What do you say for that if, obviously, he had knowledge of it, I guess it's already been testified to by an expert. Don't you think that's relevant as to motivation other than, okay, it won't matter because I'm not killing?
That was not quoted. And also, Judge, even after that arrest, he still went January 6th to get all that documentation put together. Attorney Torres, he agreed to come back with more money on January 7th. If he was feeling that it didn't matter, he wouldn't have done all that.
Well, I think that's more a weight argument. I mean, is it not? I think, isn't that what he said? If I can't,
No.
not that, if, what was the quote?
It won't matter, none of this
It
will
won't
matter tomorrow.
None of this will matter tomorrow. Isn't it reasonable argument that one would say that because the mother's in jail?
Any evidence that he knew that is?
Oh, I don't know.
And that's part of the problem.
I get it. So he told somebody, didn't he? Yeah, who did he tell that to? Some doctor testified to.
It's in the DCF reports.
I heard it.
Oh, well, we know he knows because in the, I don't know about from the stand, but we know he knows about it because when DCF went and spoke to him, DCF talked to him before. Hold on, it's in the records that he tells them she got arrested.
Before the murder.
Yes.
I thought I heard it from the stand.
I don't disagree. I think you did. I just can't think of who it came from.
I'm not aware that you
I
he was
think I
arrested. And again, Judge,
You're saying that he heard she was arrested?
Yes, he said she was arrested for a felony to somebody. I thought I heard that from this.
He said that to the Hillsborough County Sheriff's deputy that was doing the Baker Act analysis when he questioned him and said,
Okay.
why is this, why did you make this statement? That was his rational explanation for it.
And we have a report that corroborates that, so certainly I think that.
So, Mr. Boland, tell me what happened with the Hillsborough County Sheriff. He said that to him.
Well, they confronted him with all of the things that he had said to Torres, and he had explanations for everything as to why he wasn't a threat to Phoebe. And when they confronted him with that particular statement, he said something to the effect that it's because Michelle, was arrested, so none of this will matter anymore because of that, not because he was going to do something to harm Phoebe.
Okay.
So that's out there.
Okay.
That was also when he said, when he was confronted with the statement, you said Torres is God, and he said, well, the attorneys are like God, they decide things for people. So that was all part of that conversation.
And so
So you don't think that they can introduce this to corroborate the fact that it wasn't a delusion, it's not something he's making up, it's not a product of an antisocial personality disorder, but it actually happened? I'm thinking they can introduce it for that purpose.
As impeachment. I'm still trying to figure out how it gets asked.
Well, it might not be impeachment because you guys were still saying you might get into it on direct.
Well, why couldn't they ask Dr. Burston about it on cross? Like, hey, what do you think? This is what he said to the guy in Hillsborough County. Well, I don't know anything about that, blah, blah, blah. Well, take a look at this. Why couldn't you do that? And couldn't that be an explanation for it won't matter tomorrow? Or you know about it, I think you can do something with it, you're not done yet.
Again, we're back to timeliness as a problem.
Well, I don't think it would be a wise idea to exclude it. Because the interpretation of that statement is very, very important. And she just got it over the weekend. It's now Monday afternoon. Yes, probably. Why didn't you give it to him before he took the stand?
I asked my assistant to make copies and list it as additional
Why
discovery.
didn't you tell him, hey, I got this police report?
I forgot, I didn't even think about it. I did it first thing this morning and then came up here, wasn't even thinking about it, and then when he said something that triggered my memory, and I was like, oh my gosh, I need those reports now.
I don't presume people are lying. So your argument is it's basically untimely, but it might be relevant, right? Under that theory?
Well, I'm not even agreeing it's really relevant because it's again impeachment, and I don't think it's proper impeachment, but we'll abide by the court's rulings.
I understand, but I don't think it's impeachment. I think it's interpretation of a very damaging statement, and different people could interpret it. I mean, Dr. Burston has already given his interpretation of it, and it may not make any difference to him whether she was arrested for a felony.
Well, part of the problem is he's given that, but we hadn't had this for him to consider before he made that statement, and now it puts us in a very bad light. And how do we explain it? It was just produced by the defense to us? Is that how we explain it to Dr. Burston in front of the jury? Because
Yes.
that's going to require some explanation to the jury.
Yes, that's how you explain it. I'll let you do that. Yes. I think it's relevant, and I don't think it's smart to just say they can't use it in that crucial part of the case, and I understand you're referring to my ruling on that other statement, but I think that was very clear, that I couldn't let you use that statement.
You didn't make that argument, Judge.
I know. I don't see a lawful ruling that I can make that because she didn't give it to you before he started testifying, even though he's still on the stand, that she couldn't use it if she wanted to, but I imagine you're going to want to do it. and give it to him tomorrow morning before he testifies.
Well,
He's going to give it to him tonight. I don't
Okay.
understand, but that's okay, right?
Yes.
can we, since it was
Yes.
not timely, can we discuss it with him?
Yes.
Or put it back on?
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
And in your question to him, you could say, you know, we just got this last night, and you know we just got it, the whole thing. So they're not thinking that it's something he didn't know about and he's lousy, okay?
All right, Judge.
Okay?
We're allowed to talk to him about it. We just want to make
Yes.
sure we're not getting me in trouble doing that.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we're excused for the day?
You don't have to ask me that.
Right.
No, we just didn't know if there's anything else that we need to talk
Well,
about.
I don't know. Is there anything else we need to talk about?
That required you guys to answer.
I was looking at, not that I'm aware of, but.
Okay, good. All right, I'll see everybody in the morning, 9 o'clock. Have a good evening.
All right. We recess till 9 o'clock.